Hey guys, Cookie here, and today I'm going to show you how to make white bread by hand, and this recipe will make 3 loaves. So I'm starting out with a large bowl, and to this I'm adding 1 teaspoon of white sugar. And next I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of dry active yeast. And instead of buying this by the packet, I actually buy this by the 500-gram bag, and I keep it in a mason jar in the freezer to keep it fresh. Add 1 cup of warm water. And whisk it up. Make sure to get all those little bits of yeast on the side so that they all dissolve. Now we wait for the yeast to activate. Time for a coffee break. You can tell that your yeast is activated by all of the bubbles, and it will actually foam up like this. Now, obviously, you should have washed your hands before starting baking, and it's always good to practice good hand washing hygiene, but we're about to start kneading that dough, so please make sure those hands are squeaky clean. And also, don't let that water run like I am. Our hot water heater frankly sucks, so I'm just letting that water come to temperature. So again, clean those hands. Scrub for 20 seconds, squeaky clean. The last ingredients we're going to add are 2 cups of warm water. Warm milk or buttermilk is also nice. Half a cup of white sugar. Half a cup of oil or melted butter. I'm using melted butter. It doesn't matter if you use salted or unsalted. 9 cups of all-purpose or bread flour. This can also be called hard wheat flour. And 1 tablespoon of salt. I'm using sea salt. Now it's time to get messy. We're going to just roughly bring this dough together with our fingers. Go around the whole bowl with your fingers, making sure to scoop up any dry bits stuck at the sides or at the bottom, keeping one hand clean at this point. With your clean hand, use a flour sifter to sift out some flour onto your clean work surface. And this is about a half a cup or so of flour, and just set it aside and put your dough onto this floury work surface. And then you can sift about a half a cup of flour over top, and you're not going to knead all of this flour into your dough. You can just kind of push the flour aside and just use as much flour as you need at a time. Now, the flour sifter isn't absolutely necessary. I've just gotten into the habit of sifting my flour all the time, so you could totally just throw it or just sprinkle it onto the surface with your hand. That's totally up to you. So kneading the dough will be a little sticky at first, but in time it'll become a lot more elastic. And I'm going to give you the entire process so that you can actually see the dough texture change as I knead it. And kneading the dough is just a series of folding, turning, and pushing, and constantly repeating this process over and over again. It actually becomes fairly relaxing, and fairly relaxing to watch as well. If you don't do a whole lot of bread making by hand, though, this process does take about 10 minutes of constant kneading, so it might be a little tough on the arms and the hands. So if this is something that you're doing with your family, it's a fun activity that you could take turns with. And you can see that as my dough starts to stick to the work surface, I just move it aside and throw some flour underneath. Make sure to get all of those dough bits off of your fingers as well. You can see that the dough is becoming more firm and elastic. Kneading dough is actually a great stress reliever and an even greater way to get out some aggression. Don't worry, it can take it.
Round 1, fight!
So now that your arms are probably falling off by now, I'm sure that the dough has been thoroughly kneaded, and you could probably just give the dough a few little pokes and the dough should spring back upon itself. Now that we've thoroughly kneaded the dough, we need to prep it for the proofing stage. For this, we're going to add a little bit of vegetable oil to our mixing bowl. I'm using canola oil. This is so the dough doesn't stick to the bowl. When you put the dough ball into the bowl, roll it around the oil so that it gets coated. Over top, I'm going to cover it with a damp towel that I've soaked in warm water and squeezed out. Wish it lots of luck and give it some love. Now, there are a few ways that you can proof your dough. If you have a newer oven, you might have a proofing function. This allows your oven to sit at a very low temperature, ideal for rising your dough. You might have to consult your manual. What you need is a nice, warm location, and if you don't have a proofing function on your oven, you can make one yourself pretty easily. Just stick a pan in the bottom of your oven and pour boiling water into it from a kettle. Be careful not to burn yourself. Set your dough on the baking rack, close the oven, and there you go. A nice warm place for your dough to rise. You want your dough to at least double in size. This should take about an hour or so. You can see that my dough certainly doubled in size, and then some. In fact, a little bit of it actually stuck to the wet towel. I walked away for a little bit too long, so it got a little bit too happy during the proofing stage. No worries though. Watch it completely deflate as I push it down. This is what you want. We're now going to portion it into 3 equal portions for our 3 loaves. You can either eyeball it or weigh it out like I am. Depending on how much flour you ended up adding, you may get a different number, but mine came out to about 2,100 grams, so each portion is going to be around 700 grams or so. Pretty close for a first try. Now you'll want to dust your surface again with flour and work with 1 dough portion at a time. You're basically just going to flatten it out as evenly as possible into a very rough rectangle shape, and then roll it tightly into a loaf shape. If it sticks to your work surface, just pick it up and throw down more flour. You can also see that I'm kind of tucking in the ends of the dough as I'm rolling as well. It does take a little bit of practice, but try to keep the roll as tight as possible. Once you're done rolling, pinch the seam all the way from one end to the other and turn it over so that the seam is on the bottom. It should look like a loaf and be about the size to fit one of your 9-inch loaf pans. It doesn't have to be perfect. If it looks a little wonky, you can shape it a little better at this stage to fit a little nicer in your pan. Maybe the next few loaves will look nicer. I'm setting my dough into parchment-lined 9-inch loaf pans. You can also grease your pans with oil, shortening, or butter, but I much prefer parchment. You'll see why later when I release the bread from the pans. Here you can see the 3 loaves ready to go into the warm oven to proof or rise for the second time, and you can see by the time I got them into the oven for this shot, they already started to rise. You can use the same warming method as you used before. Again, it shouldn't take more than an hour for them to double in size. Sometimes you'll find that if you're making bread in the cooler months, it'll take longer for your bread to rise. And if you're making bread in the warmer months, it won't take long at all for your bread to rise. As you make bread more and more often, you'll figure this out for yourself, and you'll be able to forecast how long it should take for it to rise. Sometimes, though, bread just has a mind of its own. You can see that the bread has risen well, and I'm giving each one a generous brushing of melted butter. This will give it a great golden crust. If you proofed your dough using a pan with water in the bottom of the oven, don't forget to remove it from the oven before you preheat it. I've preheated my oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Bake your bread for 30 minutes either on the center or lower center rack. I'm using a convection oven, meaning that the oven circulates hot air inside with a fan. If you're using a conventional oven, you may have to turn your bread halfway through to get an even bake, so just keep an eye on them. When they're done, the crust will have a nice golden brown color, and they'll sound hollow when you tap the top with your finger. But if you want to get super technical, a thermometer will read at least 195 degrees Fahrenheit when inserted into the middle. While the bread is still hot from the oven, give it another brush with melted butter to make the crust nice and tender. After letting your bread cool for about 10 or 15 minutes, you can easily slip it out from the pans. See how easily it comes out from the parchment? I frickin' love this stuff. Now, I know the urge is real to cut into them right away. Your kitchen smells amazing right now and you're dying to see if you did a good job, but try to let your bread cool down for at least 30 minutes. It'll still be warm, but cool enough to cut into. The texture will be much more pleasant and it will be much easier to cut. Just like this. Isn't it absolutely beautiful? This is my go-to bread recipe and has been for many, many years. However, I cannot take credit for it. It's called Neil's Harbor White Bread from a cookbook called Food That Really Schmecks, Mennonite Country Cooking by Edna Stabler. She was from the Kitchener-Waterloo area and lived to be 100 years old and loved butter. Rest in peace, Edna. You could cut this recipe into thirds to just make one loaf, but honestly, with all of the work involved, you could just make 3 loaves and freeze the other 2. You could just make sure you wrap them up well. Or you could share with family or friends. I mean, who doesn't love fresh baked bread? It doesn't have the same preservatives that store-bought bread does, but there are so many things that you can do with stale bread. Bread pudding, French toast, grilled cheese, stuffing, the list goes on. I hope that this video was informative and inspired you to try making bread by hand. Of course, you could easily just, throw it into your mixer with a dough hook, but I feel like everyone should try making bread with their own 2 hands, at least once. It's fun, and the end product is definitely rewarding. So what are you waiting for? Let's get this bread.